Bob, I think you left school and joined the BBC almost at once.
Yes, almost at once.
So you're almost a BBC lifer.
Almost, yes. Although I took an early deal, so I had quite a few careers after that.
Right, okay.
Over the last 10 years or so.
Good. So what did you do when you joined, and how did you join?
Right. The reason I joined was that when I left school, I was interested in radio, but had no idea how I would be able to get anything like a job in any form of radio. But what I did when I left school, one of my school friends helped me build the crystal set so that I could actually listen regularly to the radio on my old headphones in bed. And that was when I started to really get a feel for music radio in the first sense of radio. And it did.
A real sort of cat's whisker job, was it?
A real cat's whisker job with headphones, and it was actually built inside an old chocolate box that my gran had given me years earlier. And we hollowed it out and put all the components together, and I strung an aerial cable all the way from my bedroom window all the way to the bottom of the garden. And believe it or not, it actually worked. So that was my introduction to regular radio listening, which has got me into the mood. But when I left school, I went into banking because my father had been in banking, and it always seemed to me that was probably a reasonable job. And since I'd been listening so much to the radio in my last years at school, my exam results weren't all it might have been, but it was enough to get me into banking. So I worked in a bank in London, actually in Great Tower Street near the Tower of London. And that same building is now there, but it's now a pub. But it became clear to me very early on that banking wasn't for me. So I started looking around for something else to do, and two jobs I got interviews for. One was the Foreign Office and the other was the BBC. And I wasn't sure whether I really wanted to be a spy, but I thought making programmes sounded like an interesting job, and it was much more akin to where my interests lie. So I got myself an interview, and my first job was in BBC Publications.
So not in radio, you were with books.
I was with books, well, to be more precise, the Radio Times and the Listener, as it then was.
And that was 35 Marylebone High Street, you said?
That was 35 Marylebone High Street. My first job was as a very lowly clerk in the circulation publicity department, doing all we could to provide all the news agents and all of these sort of folk with all the up-to-date information about what was going to be in the Listener and the Radio Times at that time. And one of the jobs I particularly remember was one of the curious things I had to do every week was every time one of the Radio Times vans came into the car park below our office window, I had to dash out with the current poster for the Radio Times and the Listener and stick them on the side of the van, taking away the previous week's one, which was always one of the biggest chores of the whole job.
Rushing down the stairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Rushing down 3 flights of stairs to catch the van before the driver drove it away again.
I suppose it was almost a bit like a newsroom, was it? Radio Times. I mean, would have been very busy, and people would have been contacting lots of other people.
Yeah, it was. Although I wasn't really involved with the editorial side of it, it was purely the publicity side for keeping the circulation up. So the department I was in, I think there were about 5 of us in there. And it was all sorts of things, from liaising with all the distribution people to liaising with news agents, keeping the database, which was then a card index system of all the news agents in the country together. So we made sure that we knew where all the Radio Times and listeners were being sent to, and that they weren't being sent to a news agent which no longer existed. And also involved in, occasionally the competitions. One of the things I remember was there was a balloon race that used to happen, which was a thing that was happening around the mid-60s, where various organisations around the country, charities and things like that, would write to BBC publications and say, we have this event happening, could we run a balloon race? And I was given the job of sending out these balloons and cards, and the whole idea was that if people would send the card, if they found a card from a balloon that had been found anywhere in the country, they would send the card back to our office at BBC Publications, and we would send them a Radio Times pen. And I did loads of that.
The lengths that people will go to advertise things.
I know. One of the other curious things I think occasionally we gave away was a Radio Times sponge, which was literally a thing for washing your car with, which said Radio Times on it.
Right. Anyway, how long did you stay in 35 Marylebone High Street?
I was in Marylebone High Street for probably about a year, because I started off in the publications circulation publicity, and then I was moved to the schools department, which was dealing with all the schools around the country that took the BBC schools publications, which accompanied all the broadcasts for schools.
Yes.
So that was a massive job at the beginning of every term, ensuring that all the schools around the country were getting the correct orders that they wanted. For the first week or two of every term, we were absolutely up to our eyes in taking phone calls from schools who'd got the wrong order, or not enough, or too many, or the wrong books and things.
Were they sending things like film strips?
That's right.
Projected,
there was that. We weren't so much involved with that. It was purely the books accompanying the radio programme series. That was in 35 Marylebone High Street. That was on the 4th floor, the floor above where I'd previously been working.
Right. Because I seem to remember educational publications moved down to 2 Marylebone High Street at one stage.
There was 1 and 2 Marylebone High Street was there when I was there as well. But yes, it was a different division, and I was never quite sure exactly what they did.
So eventually you decided to leave publishing, as it were.
Well, what it was, when I first started at the BBC, I was introduced to the BBC Club, as we all were, and there were a number of societies in the club that you could join for various activities. And the one I first joined was called SAG, the Studio Amateur Dramatic Group. And I joined that pretty well immediately, and it gave me access to radio studios and working within a radio studio.
What sort of things were you recording there?
They used to record little plays and comedy and all sorts of little shows. In fact, basically, if you had an idea for making a radio show of any type, you could put it forward, and usually you would get it accepted, and off you went. There were quite a number of people in the drama group. There were probably 30 or 40 at the time that I was there. So you usually got a chance to do something in virtually every production they were making.
And they were recorded properly?
They were recorded properly, yes, in the BBC studios. And that was my introduction to working in a radio studio, because they had their own qualified radio studio managers. They ran a course for members of the group, which was controlled by BBC Radio Training. It was mainly existing plays. 1 or 2 people did write plays. I remember a guy called, hang on a second while I remember his name.
Yeah.
Michael someone or other. Oh gosh. It'll come to me. Okay. Anyway, he did go on to write plays for BBC latterly. And so, yes, there was the opportunity to do that. But for me, it was the opportunity to learn how to be a radio studio manager, which is what I decided I wanted to be from the moment that I joined the group, really. You learnt to swing records and play in tapes, and in those days, of course, it was all analogue. So you learnt all the skills associated with analogue radio. And if you wanted to be an actual studio manager, you got examined by the official BBC radio training people, and you were then qualified to operate all the BBC radio studios on behalf of the Studio Amateur Dramatic Group.
Right, so you would then have to apply to be a studio manager. You would have to go through the usual sort of
which I did,
process,
yes, yeah. Yes, I was rejected on 2 or 3 occasions, and that was eventually how I ended up going to Scotland, because I saw a job going in Glasgow and applied for it, and lo and behold, I got it.
Okay. Now, before you leave London, as it were, were you staying in the BBC hostels?
I certainly was for a period of time, yes.
Now, I don't know whether they still exist, but tell us about them.
Yeah, they don't exist anymore. There were two of them. There was one in the west of London called the Beaumont Hostel, which tended to be mainly for the World Service people coming from abroad to start working in London. And the idea of the hostels was really to acclimatise new staff who didn't know London or had never been in London before to both the BBC and living in London before they were able to get themselves a flat or whatever for more permanent accommodation. The other hostel was just round the corner from Broadcasting House in New Cavendish Street. And that was the Redborn Hostel, the one that I stayed in. And I made lots of good friends at the Redborn Hostel. And because it was so close to Broadcasting House, it meant that it was very easy at any time of the day to wander round the corner into the studios. And I remember a friend of mine and myself, we regularly used to go down and burrow into the basement of Broadcasting House Extension, where the principal radio studios were for what were then the light programme radio programmes. And we regularly used to go and sit in on the late night radio programmes on the old light programme. People like Diddy David Hamilton, for example. Yeah. We regularly sat in on that programme, late night special and shows like that. And on a Sunday afternoon, when there wasn't much happening in the hostel, we used to go and gate crash in Studio B6 for Alan Freeman's Pick of the Pops.
Mixing with the great already.
Yeah, and that was my first meeting with Alan Freeman, and of course I worked with him on a number of occasions later after that.
What was the hostels actually like inside? I mean, what did you get in the way of a room?
They were mainly double rooms. In the Redborn where I was, the ground floor had a general lounge in the front, and the other side of the main front door there was the dining room, and the dining room served breakfasts to everyone and also an evening meal if you wished in the evening as well. You had to pay extra if you wanted an evening meal, as I remember it, but breakfast always got served. There was, on the basement, there was a tiny little television lounge which used to get very, very busy on top of the Pops nights, I remember. It wasn't really big enough for all the people in the hostel. Yeah. The accommodation was mainly double rooms, certainly for the males, and the males occupied the first floor, and as I remember it, the second and third, and I think maybe even the fourth floor were all for the females, and I think they were largely double rooms, although of course I never ever visited one. But my understanding is that they were mainly double rooms. I think there were one or two single rooms for the ladies as well.
And did people who were like announcers who were working overnight or had to be in very early in the morning, were they also using those hostels?
Certainly not when I was there. And my understanding was that they always used to go to a little room somewhere in the I think 5 Portland Place or somewhere like that. They had a couple of rooms there for the announcers.
Now, the BBC Club was, I think, in the Langham at that point. Is that right?
It was indeed, yes.
And was pretty busy at lunchtime.
It was pretty busy at lunchtime and evening, and the Langham at that time had a few radio studios in there, and on the 4th floor, that was the home of BBC Radio Training at that point. But the club was very well accommodated, and that was the place to meet people. If you wanted to meet the great and the good, you went across to the club. And that was where I first met some of the Radio 1 people when Radio 1 started.
Sure.
And got to know quite well some of them. Alan Freeman, as I've mentioned, Kenny Everett, who I used to bump into occasionally, and Stuart Henry certainly, and Emperor Roscoe. I remember having quite a number of sort of drinks and chats with at the time. Through working with the Studio Amateur Dramatic Group, occasionally you'd find yourself in studios outside of Broadcasting House, like 5 Portland Place and what was then Egton House, which is now sort of, I think, part of Wogan House now, I think. But in those days, Egton House was the headquarters of what was then gramophone record programmes. And occasionally Studio Amateur Dramatic Group was allocated a studio in Egton House, and almost invariably I'd bump into Kenny Everett in there. And we had a very similar sort of sense of humour, I think, at that time. We used to clown around at the tea bar and spill each other's coffees and silly things like that.
So he was the same off air as he was on air.
Absolutely, he was absolutely the same off air as he was on air.
Describe him a bit more, because he was quite fascinating.
Oh, he's an incredible character, yes. I mean, he had a wicked sense of humour. And my sort of main meetings with him were usually queuing up at the old tea trolleys that you may remember from the days of the BBC in the 60s.
Yes.
Every house, I think pretty well every building in the BBC of any size had a tea lady going around with a tea trolley on the different floors. And Kenny Everett and I used to frequently meet outside of Egton 1 or Egton 2 studio when the tea trolley went past. And, we were always trying to kid each other on as to what we would put in our teas and coffees. And he always used to say, what will I put in their teas this time? He was usually sent to get the teas and coffees for the other members of the team.
Oh, I see.
And And he would always say, "Oh, I'll put pepper in this one, and I'll put tea in that one." I don't know if he ever did, but he always threatened
Slip
to.
them in a Mickey Finn. Yes.
And I think when he got back, he would ask them, "Which one do you think's got the pepper in it?"
Now, weren't you involved in the recording library at some stage?
I was, yes. That was my first job actually in Broadcasting House when I left publications at Marylebone High Street. I was in a department called the Retention Unit of Current Recordings. And we were kind of the liaison between the current recordings going out on a daily basis and the storage in the main library there of the programmes, and then what got retained to go to archives, the sound archives being just a little bit down the corridor from where I worked. And in the process of ensuring there was always enough space in the library for the current recordings, every month we had to clear out the recordings which hadn't been officially retained by their production departments, so that the sound archives could then have a closer listen and decide if they were going to formally archive them on a permanent basis.
So a lot of stuff was lost, but it was fairly sort of, in those days, considered rather trivial stuff, or not.
Well, yes, that's right. A lot of stuff was lost, and I have to say, on occasion, stuff that shouldn't have been lost was lost, either because it hadn't been retained, despite us asking the production department if they wanted it kept or not, and occasionally the odd accident, I think, did occur. The department who destroyed a tape they shouldn't have destroyed, but for the most part it worked well. And I think on average, and I don't know the exact percentage, but I would probably say that from any month's recordings, probably about 5% were retained by the archive department, and probably, I don't know, most of that eventually ended up either on disc, as it then was, vinyl album, LP, or just kept as the original tape.
Oh, I see. So they were recorded on tape, then transferred to disc if they wanted to keep them in the archive.
That was the theory. A lot of them were put onto vinyl albums, but a lot of them actually were just kept as tape eventually. They didn't seem to bother mastering them to a record.
That's intriguing. So obviously talks and things like that would have been kept. 5% is a very small amount to keep.
I wouldn't have thought it was certainly no more than 10%, just judging by the amount we used to destroy from the original sort of allocation of a month's recordings.
Is there a sort of rule of thumb about what they kept?
Well, I think it was largely determined by the Sound Archive department. There were a number of selectors. I think, if I remember rightly, Maddo Stewart was one, I remember. She was one of the principal ones. But I think there were 5 or 6 selectors in the Sound Archive department who were responsible for different areas of programme, features, talks, drama, music. And I think each of those used to ask for a small selection of the programmes currently up for destruction to be listened to, and then they would determine whether they were going to keep them or whether they could be shoved back in the pile to be destroyed.
Yeah.
So I think that was the initial sort of filtering process. And then, occasionally a play. I think it wasn't so frequently that plays were retained, but certainly some dramas were retained. Quite a bit of music and a lot of talks and features.
Yes, some things presumably were kept because they could have been repeated.
Yes, well, that was the main reason initially for retention of a programme. If it wasn't being considered by archives, it was because there was a repeat scheduled in a month or two's time beyond the period of normal destruction. I think if there were, real sort of big news events that were clearly going to be of historic importance, they were pretty well retained as a matter of course. But again, one of the archive selectors, I think, would have been a news person, news and current affairs, so they would have earmarked very quickly what was going to be a historic recording that needed to be kept.
Yes, no, I mean, I'm interested in that because obviously the archive becomes more and more important as you go further and further away from those periods.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The restaurants in BH, of course, were very good at that stage. There were about 4 or 5, weren't there?
There were, yes. The one on the top floor, the 8th floor, was more or less open 24/7. If we used to go and sit in on a late night radio programme, the next stop would be midnight or thereafter, straight up to the 8th floor for a cup of coffee and usually egg and chips as well.
Now, there comes a point when you decide to move out of London. What were you doing? What sort of jobs were you looking for?
Once I'd joined the studio amateur dramatic group that I mentioned earlier, I got the bug as a studio manager for them. That was what I really wanted to be. I wanted to work on real radio programmes. And I applied on a couple of occasions on the annual round for the intake of studio managers for London. They were later becoming known as Programme Operations Assistants, or POAs, and I applied for the training course, I think 2 years running, and was rejected. And by that point I was getting a little bit fed up. I really wanted to be a studio manager, and I saw a job going in the Ariel newspaper for a studio manager in Glasgow. Mm-hmm. And I applied for it, little thinking that there'd be much chance, but I got flown up there for an interview, and lo and behold, I got a phone call later the same day to say I'd been appointed. So that changed my life, and literally changed my life, because I never ever lived in London again after that. Moved up to Glasgow, and this is me still in Scotland. 52 years later.
Are you in Scotland at the moment?
I'm in Scotland at the moment. I'm sitting in a little room in Renfrewshire here.
Okay, so you go up to Scotland, to Glasgow initially.
Queen Margaret Drive in Glasgow, broadcasting house, and as a studio manager there, working mainly on almost entirely on Scottish daily output. At that time, the output on radio in Scotland was on a network they called Radio 4 Scotland. It had previously been known as the Scottish Home Service, but then after 1967, when Radio 1, 2, 3 and 4 started, we became Radio 4 Scotland, and it was mainly an opt-out service in Scotland. We took all the Radio 4 programmes, but opted out occasionally during the day for local output, which went to the whole of Scotland. And then later that became Radio Scotland proper, and it was a separate network from Radio 4, operating, I don't know, about 10 hours a day, probably something like that.
Yeah. How did you find the culture?
Oh, it's very, very different. Yeah. They're very, very friendly people. But one of the first things I had to get used to was, of course, the fact that there was a second language in Scotland, the Gaelic language, which is obviously very prominent now. In those days, there used to be Gaelic programs at lunchtime. There was a 5-minute news and then a 15-minute record program of very, very kind of ethnic Gallic records.
Yes.
And I remember as a studio manager, it was kind of difficult because you were balancing the sound at the desk with the presenter, and then having to remotely fire in all of the material that was being played for the record program straight after off of ancient tapes and sometimes old 78 RPM records. So you were getting up from the desk having set the microphone and the fader for the gram or whatever, and you'd have to go back up and then swing the record in and make sure you got the record out again in time, and then get back to the desk.
Basically, you were sort of understaffed compared with London.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, it was a very efficient operation, I should say, but it wasn't helped by the fact that we probably had some of the oldest equipment that was going around the country. Very, very old tape recorders, EMI TR90s and things like that were usually quite unreliable. So, your heart was in your mouth every time you had to play a tape in case the thing just snapped or broke or went into fast spool or whatever.
I remember when I first joined the BBC that Radio 4 was allowed to record at 15 inches a second.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas the World Service recorded at 7.5.
That's right. I can remember that from the World Service, from the short period I was there during the training. All speech recordings at that time were being done at 7.5, and any program which had music in it, if it was, say it was a request program with records in it, that would be recorded at 15. But drama, I think, was always recorded at 15 IPS as well.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so you're actually controlling the desk, and so you were in charge of the studio. You were
totally, yeah,
studio manager, yeah,
fully fledged studio manager, yes. Yeah. And then we had our own news opt-outs. There was a program called Today in Scotland, which used to opt out from the main Today program, and that would have two studio managers, one on the desk and another one playing in all the tapes. And there were quite a lot of them, of course, in those days.
Yes. No, absolutely. What did you do about things like needle time? Do you have to report what
yes, I mean, obviously,
as
a studio manager at that time, that wasn't really so much our responsibility. But yes, there was needle time, and we didn't have very much of it in Scotland at that time, as I remember it. It wasn't until the sort of mid-70s when I started getting production attachments, I became more involved with things like needle time. But I remember around about that time there was something called radio play, which was a department which I think actually operated out of Egton House. And it was outtakes, as I remember it, of commercial recordings which had been bought by the BBC as a kind of library basis, and which all the broadcasting rights were permitted. Wow. And we used to use those quite a lot in the early 70s. Up until the period when I think the PRS and PPL and all this kind of thing dropped relaxed the rules regarding commercial radio, commercial recording performance.
You were working closely with producers, obviously, so they would be dealing with things like that.
That's right. But once I started getting attachments as a producer myself, I realised just how much more there was to production, the kind of management of the system, if you like, and all of the regulations behind publishing and copyright and all of that kind of thing, which as a studio manager you weren't really concerned with.
Sure. Now, were most people reading off scripts, or what were they doing there?
I seem to recall most programmes were scripted in those days. Yes, certainly the talks and even news, you had your cue material on a piece of paper and then the ins and outs of tapes, so that people knew at what point the studio manager would know when to play the tape and when to open the microphone, that kind of thing.
If I remember rightly, at that place in Glasgow, at Broadcasting House in Glasgow, there were some quite interesting features. Firstly, there was a bit of a Rennie Mackintosh building, which was part of a courtyard.
That's right. The main entrance in those days at Queen Margaret Drive was the old I think it had been a school at one point, but it was certainly a Rennie Mackintosh courtyard, and part of the building which housed what was then Radio Studio 2 was part of the old Rennie Mackintosh building. And I found myself in Studio 2 quite a lot, because that was the secondary, if you like, music radio studio, where live music would be recorded for local shows on Radio Scotland. And we did quite a few sessions with Scottish artists for what was then Radio 1 and Radio 2 in that studio as well. And then, of course, there was the bigger Studio 1, which was the main, the principal, if you like, Abbey Road type studio for the recording of music, orchestras and large sessions.
Yes, there was a BBC Scottish orchestra at that stage, which I imagine has it kept its name? I can't remember now.
Well, the orchestras are long gone now, unfortunately, but there were two.
Yes, but I thought they became, as it were, national orchestras.
There is a national orchestra, but yes, purely the symphony orchestra, all the pop and light music orchestras around the country were disbanded. And we had two orchestras in Scotland. There was the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, which still exists, and there was also the Scottish Radio Orchestra, which was conducted by Brian Fay, who had been Shirley Bassey's musical director at one time.
Oh, right. That's presumably the equivalent of the concert orchestra, is it?
Probably, yes, but there were other orchestras around the country. There was the NDO, the Northern Dance Orchestra, and I think most of the regions had a popular music orchestra at that time, but they were all disbanded at one point, and they just left the principal
just the symphony orchestra, yeah.
Symphony orchestras and classical music orchestra, and as you say, the concert orchestra.
What year was this? You moved up to Glasgow?
I moved up to Glasgow in 1970, and that was when, shortly afterwards, I started to get to work with some of the big names, because quite frequently they would come up to Scotland for one purpose or another, or they were on a tour or something, and it wasn't really convenient for them to go back to London in the middle of it all to do their usual programmes. So that was how I got to work with a number of the Radio 1 and 2 people, and Alan Freeman came up to do a show, and I renewed my acquaintance with him there. Yeah. I worked with Stuart Henry, who came up on a number of occasions to do his Radio 1 show from Glasgow, and Terry Wogan I worked with on 3 occasions when his morning programme came up to be done from Glasgow. And Emperor Roscoe, Jimmy Young did his shows up here on a few occasions, and I worked with him. And of course, young Ken Bruce I worked with in the very early days of his career. In fact, I think I worked on his very first programmes that he did for Radio Scotland before he moved down to London for Radio 2. I actually produced Ken Bruce latterly in the early 80s during the period when he was going down at the weekend to do a show and coming back to do a weekly show on Radio Scotland.
What were these guys like when you sat in the canteen with them, presumably? Or?
Oh yes, yeah, they were just the same as anybody else. That was the beauty of it. I'd always been in awe of these kind of folk from afar, listening on the radio, and then when I got to work with them, I realised they were just ordinary people, and usually they were very, very nice people indeed, with no airs or graces. Ken Bruce and do you remember Charles Nove? I think he's now on Scala Radio, but he's been on BBC Radio for many, many years and was an announcer down, I think, on Radio 2 for a while as well. But Ken and Charles used to take the mickey out of each other all the time when they were doing announcer shifts on Radio Scotland. And there was one famous occasion which I'm sure wasn't unique to them, but I remember Ken Bruce reading the news and somebody setting fire to the bottom of the script, and the trick was to try and finish the news story before the paper burnt completely in his hand.
That's incredible. No, you wouldn't get that nowadays, not with health and safety.
Oh no, health and safety paid to a lot of that. But yes, it was interesting to get to meet names that you'd heard of that you didn't realise at that time principally worked out of Scotland, like Magnus Magnusson and Jimmy McGregor, who I got to work with on a regular basis,
Right.
first as a studio manager and then producing their programmes in Scotland.
Now, you also had BBC Edinburgh. There was
Yes,
BH in Edinburgh. That was a much smaller outfit, I think.
it was a smaller outfit. It was 5 Queen Street in Edinburgh. I think it was 2 or 3 old houses in Edinburgh that were knocked together. And it was very much kind of like 40 towers inside, with stairs going up and coming straight down again, not appearing to go anywhere, largely because of the fact that it had been separate houses all knocked together.
Yes.
But they had a number of studios. I think they had 2 or 3 talk studios and a big Studio One orchestral stage area.
But that's all gone, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, Queen Street they moved out of a good number of years ago now. I can't remember exactly when it was. And the main Edinburgh presence now is somewhere called the Tun, which was down towards Holyrood.
Down by the Parliament building.
But it's
Yeah.
it's principally a news operation now, the Edinburgh site,
Yeah.
as are indeed most of the other BBC sites apart from Glasgow. Glasgow,
Very dramatic building on the edge
Yeah.
of the water.
that's right. Pacific Quay is really the headquarters of BBC Scotland, and most of the major operation comes out of there. Although there are presences all around the country still, in Aberdeen, in Dundee, down in the borders, in Dumfries and Selkirk. There's Inverness, which also houses a lot of the Gaelic operation. There's Stornoway out in the Western Isles. There's a small new studio in Skye. And then up in Orkney and Shetland.
Now, did you go right up there to work?
Not as a studio manager or producer, but in the early 90s, after I'd done an attachment in London with radio training for 18 months, they decided they were going to set up a training unit in Scotland purely for Radio Scotland itself. And I applied and was appointed as the training manager. And part of my job was to ensure that all training needs that could be done from Scotland were done by me on site. So yes, I went round every single one of these sites at various times, and we ran production courses for new intake producers. They were mainly based in Aberdeen because we used the big Studio One area as a kind of common room and training area.
So, apart from Edinburgh and Glasgow, Aberdeen was the biggest, presumably.
That was the biggest. Then Inverness was the next biggest.
Right.
I think probably now Inverness is bigger because Aberdeen, the old building in Aberdeen was knocked down and a smaller news type operation studio was built with a couple of small studios in it, but nothing like the scale it had been on before.
No.
So I would think probably the biggest operations now outside of Pacific Quay are very probably the Inverness and Stornoway studios where all the Gaelic comes from.
Now, the further north you got, presumably the more interesting it was.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had never been to Orkney or Shetland until I became training manager.
Yeah.
And they were very slick and smart operations, but a totally different sort of way of life up there. And it was very interesting, very friendly people, and the stations themselves only had 3 or 4 people working in them, and I think probably 50% of that was freelance staff. I think there were only 2 people at Orkney and Shetland who were actually on the staff permanently.
Ah, I see. So, but it's local radio and Gaelic radio.
Well, Gaelic was Western Isles, and Orkney and Shetland wasn't Gaelic, or isn't Gaelic, I should say. That was purely sort of local for the island communities on the Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands. And largely they were opt-outs from the BBC Radio Scotland network. There was a morning opt-out, I think, on Orkney, and an evening opt-out on Shetland every day for half an hour. And I think sometimes there was a 5-minute news opt-out in the evening I don't remember exactly how the opt-out systems worked, but at various times there were local opt-outs on Orkney and Shetland. Otherwise, they just carried the main news programs from Radio Scotland.
So there wasn't a sort of 24-hour local radio.
Oh no,
Anything like that.
no, not till commercial radio came to Orkney and Shetland, which they both have commercial stations now. But BBC is still mainly the Radio Scotland network going out there. I started the training role at the beginning of the 90s. I'd been at Grafton House in BBC Radio training for 18 months on attachment from the end of 1988. Prior to that, I'd worked for nearly a year on the Glasgow Garden Festival in 1988, and we were doing daily programs from there. I did over 100 live radio programs from there. I moved on attachment straight after that down to radio training. And after 18 months there, I moved up at the start of 1990 into the training manager role for Scotland.
Right. Now, you were training engineers or studio managers, were you?
Absolutely everything. What at Grafton or in London or in Glasgow?
Well, anyway, I'm just interested in what radio training consists of, because obviously there's some training for people who are going to be presenters or producers.
That's right.
Yeah, and presumably they're expected to know a bit about the technical side of things.
Yeah, I mean, more so since we went kind of on a self-op basis, that became more and more incorporated into so-called production training. But down in when I was down at Grafton House for that 18 months, the first 9 months, I would say, I was working with the production training people. So you were training new producers and presenters as well, doing voice work with them, but mainly production techniques for people who are going to work on World Service, Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, and Radio 5, as it was just starting to come in those days. Shortly after that, I thought I was going to go back to Glasgow, and they asked me if I would then move down to the studio manager training, which I did for another 9 months. And again, that was training people for World Service and Radio 1, 2, 3, and 4 studio managers.
Now, when you were hopping about, going down to London and then going back to Scotland, presumably the BBC was fairly generous with expenses and things like that.
Yes, they would pay your expenses. You had to make sure you had receipts for everything or you wouldn't get it. But yes, they pretty well covered that, yes.
You became a producer, so you presumably also became a sort of reporter, did you, at some stage?
I'd had, as I think I mentioned earlier, in the early 70s, once I started doing SMing in Glasgow, I was trying to get into production, and I had a number of attachments to entertainment department in 1974 was the first production attachment. Then I had another one a couple of years after that, another one in 83, and another one in 1985. So it wasn't until 1985 that I actually got a substantive producer post. Right. But I'd worked on all sorts of areas of programming as a producer during that period. But what I wanted to be after having been a studio manager for a number of years was to become a producer, which is how I got into that. But during that time, I did make some programs and presenting them myself, just purely offering them to departments as a kind of independent studio manager trying to become a producer. Yeah. I have produced this. Would you be interested in it? Yeah. And I got some stuff on the air. Yeah. I did a program on the music group Gallagher and Lyle. I did another one on Jerry Rafferty, and a few programs like that, which found their way onto the air, onto the main Radio Scotland network, and one or two occasionally found their way onto Radio 2. And the first time I actually went up to Shetland, I met someone who'd been involved with the Mau Mau in Kenya, which was an interesting story for somebody living in Shetland.
Yes.
And so I went out and interviewed this lady, and I actually sold the story to Woman's Hour on Radio 4. So I found myself actually as an interviewer with I think it was about 12-minute package on Radio 4's Woman's Hour at one point.
When you say sell, do you mean persuade them to take, or do you mean actually
Yes,
sold?
actually sold in as much as if you were not an actual producer or presenter,
Yes.
there was this thing called a staff contribution fee, which
Oh, right.
you were paid a sort of small percentage of what a normal person would have got, but it was
Yes.
a token payment for the fact that you weren't really a producer or a presenter and you were doing this.
I normally remember it being staff no fee.
Yes, well, it usually was, but I was quite fortunate. My interests being in popular music as well. At that time, in the sort of mid '70s up until the late '70s, there was nobody in the newsroom or anywhere who was interested in popular music, and I got to know a number of people at various record companies and found out when folk were coming to Scotland, and I used to get in there and interview these folk at their concerts and sold the stories to Today in Scotland or Good Morning Scotland as it later became. So I had a number of popular music interviews on these programs as well as a
Ah, very good.
as a staff contribution fee.
That was the main area of interest, was it? It was popular music,
Yeah, I mean that's
yeah.
still my interest now.
But
So
rather Radio 2 than Radio 1, I
uh,
suspect.
well, yes, Radio One music up until sort of the early '70s, I would say yes, was the kind of popular music that I enjoyed. But once Radio 2 sort of and Radio 1 started to divert more from each other, I found myself more on a Radio 2 type of music.
Sure. If you were in London, you had a huge music library, record library. You could get anything out, presumably, to put on the air. Now, what did you have in Scotland?
There was a Graham Library in Scotland, not on the same scale, but amazingly, it did have quite a large selection of stuff. And of course, they regularly would liaise with the main library in London. And if you got your request in early enough for a program that you wanted a particular record, if it wasn't available in the Glasgow Library, they'd request it up from London. Usually, if they had more than one copy in London, you'd be sent one for the duration of making the program, and it got sent back again straight after.
I see. It would never be played up the line and recorded locally or anything
On,
like that.
on occasion, that did happen if they were very rare recordings. I can remember sometimes if there wasn't actually a vinyl copy in the Graham Library in London. The Graham Library was also based in Egton House at that point,
Yes.
and occasionally they would send up a tape copy, and latterly, occasionally you would get it dubbed up the line if you needed it in a hurry.
Did Radio Scotland feel very much that it was its own organisation, or did it feel that it was sort of second rate and just subsidiary to London?
I think there were kind of mixed views on that. I mean, because it was a national network as opposed to just a region, it had more status than maybe somewhere like maybe the Midlands or something like that. In as much as it was a national network, and this obviously was before BBC Scotland and the Scottish National Party had got the prominence it has now. But I think in those days it was aware of being a national network, and although it was to some extent seen by England, if you like, as secondary, I think it largely regarded itself as on a par with the main BBC.
Yes, but now I mean it's very powerful.
Oh yes, very much so. BBC Scotland, particularly, I would say, is probably the most powerful of the three national networks. Wales is not far behind, and Northern Ireland, I would say, probably in third place, purely in terms of staffing and amount of output.
Now, how did your BBC career end?
Yes, to be honest, I took early retirement. Voluntary, in inverted commas, redundancy,
Ah,
when it became clear that they no longer valued local production training. They were persuaded that if we had one training department somewhere in the BBC, that was quite enough for the whole of Scotland. And I don't want to go into politics, but clearly
no.
they didn't realise at that time that London's radio training wasn't really quite so aware of the, so we say, exigencies of Scottish output
Yes.
as a local person on site would have been, but we'll leave it at that, shall we? And just say
Okay.
that just say that I took early retirement and went freelance almost immediately, and within weeks was back in BBC Scotland doing training as a freelance.
And doing any broadcasting yourself?
Yes, I did make the odd programme which I submitted to Radio Scotland departments, and some of it went out. Funnily enough, I actually found myself doing one or two programmes which went out on commercial radio in Scotland. The Stirling radio station, I remember, took one of my ideas for a programme. So I was still hanging in there and still building up my collection of popular music albums, CDs, tapes, and eventually MP3s, which I now use to this day on my local radio programme.
So, tell me about your local programme now.
Paisley is the main town in Renfrewshire where I live, and they used to have a radio station many years ago, but it got subsumed into another commercial station. So Paisley didn't have a radio station for a number of years until 2019. They got a community radio licence for the Renfrewshire area, and I got in touch with one of the guys who was on the board, who was setting it up, asking it basically if he wanted any help, and he said yes. So I gave him some advice on equipment and various stuff like that, and he asked if I wanted to do a show. He said, "Would you be interested in doing the daily morning programme?" I thought that was a bit much, but I said no. I'm happy to do a weekly music show, and that's what I do on a Sunday night every Sunday since the station went on air. Well, not immediately since the station went on air, but since the beginning of February 2020, I've done the show every Sunday night.
And do you have any links still with the BBC in professionally?
Not professionally, no. I still keep in touch with one or two people who work from the BBC, but they've all left now. So the only time I really have anything to do with people outside of that is they have an annual sort of get together every Christmas time when current staff and former staff get together. So yes, that's when I get a chance to meet and talk to them. But otherwise, I haven't really been involved with the BBC as the BBC so much since that time, except during the period when I was working with Broadcast Journalism Training Council.
Tell me about that, yeah.
Well, the Broadcast Journalism Training Council is the main accreditation body for university courses doing broadcast journalism. And I was brought on board round about the same time that I left the staff of the BBC. When I was first doing my freelance work, they asked me if I would be involved as the member for Scotland. So I would go on panels for accrediting courses, on broadcast journalism courses all around the country. And obviously, when Scotland universities started doing it, I was the one who principally went out there to liaise with them and then chaired all the accreditation council member meetings that accredited the courses or not, as the case may be.
Now, do you think most people now coming into broadcasting are trained by the universities rather than by the broadcasters?
I think that's the case, yes. I think the BBC maybe does do some training for broadcasters, but I think increasingly new recruits are taken off the journalism courses. Apart from anything else, it makes it a lot cheaper for the BBC.
Yeah, indeed. I think we've probably covered it, haven't we? Are there any areas that you've missed out?
The Edinburgh Commonwealth Games in 1970 when I first moved up there. And then, of course, the 1988 Glasgow Garden Festival was literally, we were decanted to a caravan, and we worked there for virtually, I think it was about 10 months of the Garden Festival. So we were living on board living at the Glasgow Garden Festival site for all of that period. You know, there's the famous story of the opening of the Glasgow Garden Festival, which I was covering with a large radio mic. Yes, so can I mention the opening of the Glasgow Garden Festival, because that's quite an amusing story. Radio Scotland was covering the entire opening of the Glasgow Garden Festival, which was opened by Prince Charles the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana. And one of the jobs I had to do was to chase around with a radio mic and one of these great big Dougal type, you remember the gun mic things that they used to have.
Yes.
And I was chasing around, following Princess Diana and Prince Charles, and literally while one of the other members of staff was doing the commentary, I was pointing the microphone and following them all around the place as they were describing what was happening for the opening of the festival. And at one point, the cable for this microphone, which was attached to the radio mic transmitter, got under my feet just as we were walking in front of the carriage being pulled along, housing Princess Diana and the Prince of Wales. And I tripped over this cable, and all I could hear was laughter, and I suddenly became aware it was Princess Diana thought this extremely funny. So she was laughing, and we actually sort of eyes locked for a brief second at one another as she sort of expressed her sympathy and humour at the event.
Well, I hope you were able to go on recording after that.
Nothing was lost from the recording, I can assure you.
Did you pick up the laughter?
I think the laughter was picked up, probably. Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
It was live, of course. It wasn't recording. It was live.
Oh, I see. Yes, okay, great. All right. Well, I think we've probably finished it.
Okay.
Thanks very much. It's extremely nice to talk to you.
My pleasure, David.